40 kilometers northeast of what is now Mexico City, on a high plain ringed by volcanic mountains, there once stood a city so vast that when a different people finally rediscovered its ruins many centuries after it had fallen silent, they could not believe ordinary human beings had built it. They walked its central avenue past pyramids taller than almost anything else that had ever risen in the Americas, past hundreds of smaller platforms stretching to the horizon in every direction, and they concluded that only gods could have raised something on this scale. So they gave the ruins a name in their own language, Teotihuacan, meaning roughly the place where the gods were born, or the place where men became gods, and that borrowed name is the only one that has survived into the present. The people who actually designed the grid, quarried the stone, plastered the pyramids in brilliant color, and lived by the tens of thousands within its walls left no inscription anywhere on the site recording what they called their own home. Tonight's story is about that city, one of the largest and most influential urban centers anywhere on Earth in its own era, and about how completely its builders managed to vanish from the historical record while their monuments simply refused to disappear. Construction at the site began modestly, sometime around 100 BCE, in a shallow valley already dotted with smaller farming settlements drawing on reliable springs and obsidian deposits nearby. Within a few centuries that modest beginning had become something almost without precedent anywhere in the ancient Americas. By roughly 400 CE, at its height, Teotihuacan sprawled across more than 20 square kilometers and may have housed somewhere between 100 and 200,000 residents, estimates that would make it, at the time, one of the 6 or 7 largest cities anywhere on the planet, larger than contemporary Rome by some reckonings and vastly larger than any other city then standing in the Western Hemisphere. It achieved that scale roughly 1,000 years before the rise of the Aztec Empire that would eventually stumble across its abandoned ruins, which means the very people who named the site and mythologized it as the literal birthplace of the sun had no living memory of it at all. To them, Teotihuacan was already ancient history, a landscape of giants from a forgotten age. The city's layout is one of the most immediately striking things about it, because almost nothing about it looks accidental. A central thoroughfare, more than 2 kilometers long and unusually wide even by modern standards, runs on a fixed north-south axis through the heart of the site. Later visitors, again the Aztecs, misread the platforms lining this avenue as burial mounds housing the remains of the gods who had died to create the world, and named the road the Avenue of the Dead accordingly, a name that has stuck ever since even though archaeologists have found these structures were mostly temple platforms and elite residential compounds rather than tombs. Along and around that avenue rise the city's 3 great monuments, the Pyramid of the Sun, third largest pyramid ever built anywhere on Earth by volume, constructed above a natural cave archaeologists believe held deep ritual significance for the people who chose this exact spot, the somewhat smaller Pyramid of the Moon at the avenue's northern end, fronted by its own grand plaza, and to the south, enclosed within a walled compound called the Ciudadela, the Temple of the Feathered Serpent, its facade once covered in extraordinary carved stone heads of a plumed snake and a second horned or goggle-eyed creature associated with storms, fire, and war. Nothing about this arrangement is oriented to true north. The entire city grid sits rotated roughly 15.5 degrees east of it instead, a deliberate and remarkably consistent choice that shows up in structure after structure across the whole urban footprint, suggesting a single unifying survey and plan imposed at or near the city's founding rather than centuries of organic sprawl. Researchers have proposed several explanations for that specific angle, including alignment with the setting position of the Pleiades star cluster on the dates of the year when the sun passes directly overhead at this latitude, a genuinely significant astronomical event so close to the equator, and alignment with peaks on the surrounding horizon that would have framed sunrise and sunset on ritually important dates. Whatever the precise astronomical reasoning, the practical result was a city planned with an almost obsessive geometric discipline, its avenues, plazas, and even a nearby river channel forced into aerostraight alignment with that founding grid, imposing cosmic order onto the landscape itself in a way archaeologists rarely see expressed this thoroughly anywhere else in the ancient world. Feeding and supplying a population this large required an economy every bit as organized as the grid it was built on. Excavated workshop districts scattered across the city show entire neighborhoods given over to specialized craft production, above all the working of obsidian, the black volcanic glass quarried from nearby deposits and napped into blades, spear points, and ceremonial objects with an efficiency and consistency that suggests something close to standardized, almost industrial output rather than individual artisans working in isolation. Some compounds appear to have specialized in shell and feather work, others in ceramics produced specifically for export, and archaeologists have identified what was likely a large open marketplace near the Ciudadela where goods produced across these specialized neighborhoods, along with food brought in from the surrounding countryside, would have been traded and redistributed to feed the urban population day to day. The farmland immediately around the city, drained by a modified and straightened river channel forced into alignment with the same grid governing the rest of the site, was intensively cultivated, and researchers believe the surrounding basins, lakes and wetlands supplemented that harvest with fish, waterfowl, and the kind of raised field cultivation later famously perfected by the Aztecs themselves on the very same lake system centuries afterward. Religious life at Teotihuacan centered on a cluster of deities whose imagery recurs constantly across its murals, sculpture, and ceramics, chief among them a still unnamed figure modern archaeologists call the Great Goddess, closely associated with water, caves, spiders, owls, and the fertility of the earth itself, appearing far more often across the city's surviving art than any male deity and possibly functioning as the closest thing Teotihuacan had to a unifying patron divinity. Alongside her stood the goggle-eyed storm god, forerunner of the deity the Aztecs would later know as Tlaloc, associated with rain, lightning, and war, and the feathered serpent whose carved image dominates the Ciudadela's central temple. Households across the city, wealthy and modest alike, maintained small domestic shrines and burned incense in distinctive candelabra-shaped burners recovered by the thousands in excavations, suggesting a genuinely devotional daily life practiced at the level of the individual family compound and not only through grand state ceremony at the pyramids themselves. Most of the population lived not in scattered individual houses but inside roughly 2,000 walled residential compounds distributed across the city, dense multifamily apartment complexes built around shared interior courtyards, each housing what was likely an extended kin group or a community bound together by shared craft or trade. Some of these compounds, like the one modern archaeologists call Teotihuacan, were richly decorated with polychrome murals of jaguars, feathered serpents, flowering trees, and processions of ritual figures, painted in mineral pigments that remain startlingly vivid today, nearly 16 centuries later. Others were considerably plainer, and the contrast between them gives archaeologists one of their clearest windows into real social stratification within the city, since wealthier compounds cluster closer to the ceremonial core while more modest ones spread toward the periphery, all still built to the same disciplined grid regardless of the residents' apparent status. What makes Teotihuacan especially unusual, and especially frustrating for archaeologists trying to reconstruct its political history, is what is almost entirely missing from its art. Across the rest of ancient Mesoamerica, and especially among the Maya city-states flourishing in the same general era, rulers commissioned carved stone monuments recording their own names, their birth dates, their conquests, and their genealogies in intricate hieroglyphic writing, giving later researchers an actual roster of individual kings to work from. Teotihuacan has produced nothing comparable. No royal portrait has ever been confidently identified. No inscription names a single ruler, dynasty, or royal lineage anywhere on the site, despite a century of excavation. The city did use a system of glyph-like signs, visible in murals and on painted vessels, but it has never been convincingly deciphered as full narrative writing, and it certainly never memorialized individual monarchs the way Maya inscriptions did just a few hundred kilometers away. The city's population itself appears to have been assembled deliberately in its earliest phase, and not purely through organic growth. Settlement surveys of the wider basin of Mexico show a number of smaller regional centers losing population sharply in the first couple of centuries CE at almost exactly the same time Teotihuacan's own footprint balloons, a pattern several archaeologists interpret as evidence of forced or strongly incentivized resettlement. Whole communities drawn or compelled from the surrounding countryside into the new capital as its founders consolidated the entire basin's population and resources into a single dominant urban center, an act of state building on a scale that, again, has no clearly named ruler standing behind it in the historical record to take credit or blame. That striking absence has pushed many archaeologists toward the idea that Teotihuacan may have been governed by something other than a single all-powerful king, perhaps a council or coalition of elite lineages sharing authority collectively, its art deliberately emphasizing shared religious and cosmic themes, the storm god, the feathered serpent, the so-called great goddess associated with water, caves, and fertility, rather than the individual glory of any one ruler. Not every researcher accepts this reading, and some argue the absence of named rulers reflects gaps in the archaeological record rather than a genuinely different form of government, but the pattern is consistent enough across 4 centuries of the city's peak that it remains one of the most actively debated questions in all of Mesoamerican archaeology. How do you run a city of 200,000 people for 400 years without ever writing down a single king's name? Isotope analysis of skeletal remains recovered from residential compounds across the city adds another genuinely remarkable layer to that picture, revealing that Teotihuacan was home to distinct ethnic enclaves from across a huge stretch of Mesoamerica, drawn there by trade, craft specialization, and the city's evident economic gravity. A neighborhood identified through its architecture and burial goods as home to migrants from Oaxaca, hundreds of kilometers to the south, maintained its own Zapotec-style tombs and funerary customs generations after settling within the city. A separate cluster of residences shows material culture consistent with Maya migrants, quite possibly merchants or diplomats maintaining a permanent foreign quarter analogous to an embassy district in a modern capital. This was, by any reasonable measure, a genuinely cosmopolitan metropolis, multiple languages spoken across its neighborhoods, multiple regional identities preserved generations after arrival, all coexisting inside a single unified urban plan. If the quiet, methodical strangeness of a city this vast that somehow left no king's name behind is helping you settle in for the night, this is a good moment to hit subscribe, because the story is about to move underneath the Temple of the Feathered Serpent, into one of the most disturbing and revealing archaeological discoveries this show has covered. Excavations beneath and around the Feathered Serpent Pyramid, carried out most extensively by archaeologist Saburo Sugiyama and his colleagues starting in the 1980s, uncovered the remains of more than 200 individuals buried in the pyramid's foundations, deposited there as part of a single coordinated dedication ceremony when the structure was completed sometime around 200 CE. The bodies were arranged with unmistakable deliberation, positioned in symmetrical rows and clusters oriented outward from the pyramid center, many with their arms bound behind their backs, many wearing necklaces strung with real and imitation human jaw and maxilla bones, and many dressed in matching military-style regalia consistent with high-status warriors rather than random captives. Some researchers argue the uniformity and warrior costuming suggest at least some of these people may have been willing or ritually designated sacrificial participants tied to the city's own martial elite, rather than exclusively foreign war captives, though that interpretation remains genuinely contested. What is not contested is the scale and precision of the event itself, a mass sacrifice numbering in the hundreds, carried out in a single coordinated episode to consecrate the city's most overtly militaristic and cosmologically loaded monument. The scale of that single dedication event only becomes stranger the longer archaeologists have had to sit with it. 200 bound and costumed individuals is a mass sacrifice on a scale that has few genuine parallels anywhere else in the ancient Americas, and Sugiyama's team has spent decades trying to work out where so many suitable people, evidently trained or at least equipped as warriors, could plausibly have come from for a single ceremony marking the completion of one building. Some have suggested the individuals may have been drawn from across the city's own emerging military class, a kind of collective founding sacrifice binding the young institution of organized Teotihuacan warfare directly into the foundations of its most overtly martial monument. Others still favor the more straightforward reading that these were captives taken in warfare against neighboring polities, brought back specifically to be sacrificed at the dedication of a temple whose facade, after all, is dominated by exactly the kind of goggle-eyed war and storm imagery that would make such an offering thematically coherent. Either way, whatever the individual's original identity, the ceremony itself stands as some of the clearest physical evidence anywhere in Teotihuacan for how thoroughly organized state violence was woven into the founding of its most important buildings from remarkably early in the city's history. Deeper investigation turned up something even stranger. In 2015, archaeologist Sergio Gomez, following a tunnel discovered beneath the Feathered Serpent pyramid roughly a decade earlier, reached a set of chambers around 18 meters underground that had lain completely sealed since sometime in antiquity. Inside, his team found thousands of ritual offerings, jade figurines, carved shells, rubber balls, jaguar remains, and, strangest of all, pools of liquid mercury spread across sections of the tunnel floor, along with hundreds of metallic spheres researchers believe were coated in a mineral called pyrite, which would once have made them shimmer like reflective stars in torchlight. No comparable use of liquid mercury has been documented anywhere else in the ancient Americas, and researchers still debate what it was meant to represent: an underground river, a mirror of the night sky, a symbolic entrance to the underworld the whole tunnel was apparently designed to model. Gomez's team has speculated that a still unopened chamber deeper in the tunnel complex may hold the burial of an important early ruler or founding figure, someone whose name, if it was ever written down at all, has not yet been recovered, but as of the most recent excavation seasons that chamber remains formally unconfirmed, one more sealed unknown at the literal heart of a city already defined by them. Bioarchaeological study of the thousands of skeletons recovered from residential compounds across the city has filled in a great deal of what daily life actually cost the people who built and maintained all of this. Isotope analysis of bone and teeth confirms a diet built heavily around maize, supplemented by beans, squash, and, for wealthier households, a considerably wider range of imported and hunted foods, a nutritional gap between rich and poor neighborhoods that mirrors the architectural gap visible in the compounds themselves. Skeletal markers of chronic physical stress, including evidence consistent with repetitive heavy labor and, in some individuals, signs of nutritional deficiency during childhood, appear more frequently among residents of the planar, more peripheral compounds than among those closer to the ceremonial core, a pattern researchers read as physical, bodily evidence of the same social stratification the murals and architecture already suggested, written not into stone this time but into the bones of the people who actually lived it. Teotihuacan's influence reached far beyond its own walls, and nowhere is that reach documented more dramatically than at Tikal, one of the great Maya city-states of the Petén lowlands, more than 1,000 kilometers to the southeast. Maya hieroglyphic inscriptions at Tikal record an event in the year 378 CE that archaeologists now generally call the Entrada, the arrival of a figure named Teotihuacan, whose name translates roughly to "fire is born," described in the inscriptions with imagery and titles strongly associated with Teotihuacan rather than with any established Maya royal lineage. On the very day Teotihuacan is recorded arriving at Tikal, the reigning Maya king simply disappears from the historical record, and a new ruler, Yax Nunahian, is installed in his place, a ruler whose own portraits show him dressed in unmistakably Teotihuacan-style military regalia, including the goggle-eyed storm deity imagery associated with the distant central Mexican city. Whether this represents an actual military conquest, a diplomatic coup engineered through local proxies, or an elite marriage alliance dressed up in the language and imagery of foreign power, researchers still actively disagree, but the inscriptions leave little doubt that Teotihuacan's authority, or at least its prestige and iconography, was potent enough to reshape dynastic succession at one of the most powerful Maya kingdoms of the era from well over 1,000 kilometers away. Similar Teotihuacan-linked imagery and architecture shows up at Caminaljuyu in the Guatemalan highlands, where structures built in the distinctive Teotihuacan talatablero style, alternating sloped and vertical wall panels, appear directly alongside local Maya construction, and at Copan and other Maya centers further south, where rulers occasionally invoked Teotihuacan ancestry or imagery to bolster their own legitimacy generations after any direct contact had presumably ended. On the Gulf Coast of Mexico, at a site called Matacapan in what is now Veracruz, archaeologists have identified what looks like an actual resident Teotihuacan enclave rather than mere stylistic borrowing, complete with talatablero architecture, imported Teotihuacan-style ceramics, and burial customs matching those found in the capital itself, suggesting the city maintained something closer to permanent trading colonies in at least some of the more distant regions it drew resources from, cacao and rubber in Matacapan's case, rather than relying purely on long-distance exchange passed hand-to-hand between independent intermediaries. Green obsidian sourced specifically from mines controlled by Teotihuacan turns up in archaeological deposits across an enormous swath of Mesoamerica, evidence of a trade and exchange network that carried the city's material culture, and quite possibly its political reach, across a huge and ethnically diverse region without any of it requiring a single readable word of Teotihuacano writing to survive for archaeologists to reconstruct the story from today. Not every scholar reads the Entrada, or Teotihuacan's broader footprint across the Maya world, as evidence of direct military conquest. Epigraphers including David Stewart, who has spent decades working on the Tikal inscriptions describing Teotihuacan's arrival, have pointed out that the text never explicitly claims Teotihuacan itself sent an army, and some researchers now favor a more layered picture in which local Maya elites, competing against rival dynasties, actively invoked Teotihuacan's prestige and imagery to legitimize their own power grabs, adopting the distant city's iconography the way an ambitious noble might once have claimed descent from Rome or Byzantium without either empire lifting a single soldier to make it happen. Under this reading, Teotihuacan's real power over the Maya world may have rested less on direct political control and more on sheer cultural gravity, a prestige so potent that simply being associated with it, correctly or not, could reshape a kingdom's succession from well over 1,000 kilometers away, which is arguably a stranger and more interesting kind of influence than conquest would have been. And then, across the 6th century CE, the city that had dominated Mesoamerica for 400 years began to come apart with a violence that stands in sharp contrast to its earlier centuries of apparent stability. Excavations along the Avenue of the Dead reveal a devastating episode of deliberate, systematic burning, most heavily concentrated precisely at the structures that mattered most: temples, elite residential compounds, and monumental sculpture along the ceremonial core, while many ordinary residential neighborhoods elsewhere in the city show comparatively little destruction from the same period. Excavators have found statues deliberately toppled, decapitated, and dragged from their original positions, doorway lintels burned and collapsed, and elite compounds torched with an intensity and apparent targeting that argues strongly against a random accident or a single isolated fire. That pattern, destruction concentrated almost surgically on the symbols and residences of Teotihuacan's own governing elite while sparing much of the wider city, has convinced many archaeologists that what happened around 550 to 600 CE looks less like an external invasion and more like an internal uprising. Ordinary residents or a rival faction within the city turning violently against the specific monuments and households that represented centralized authority, a targeted repudiation rather than indiscriminate conquest. Other researchers argue for a more layered explanation, pointing to paleoclimate evidence for serious, prolonged drought affecting the wider region across roughly this same window, stress that could plausibly have undermined agricultural surplus, strained the elite's ability to provision the city's enormous population, and helped trigger exactly the kind of internal unrest the burning pattern suggests. Environmental catastrophe and political collapse arriving together rather than as competing rival explanations. Still others haven't ruled out external pressure entirely, whether rival regional powers taking advantage of Teotihuacan's weakening grip or some combination of internal revolt and outside opportunism converging on the city within the same turbulent decades. Whatever the precise mixture of causes, the effect on the city itself was severe and largely permanent. Population estimates fall sharply in the decades following the burning. Monumental construction along the ceremonial core stops entirely, and while people continued living in parts of the city for generations afterward, in numbers and in an organizational form that looks nothing like the disciplined imperial capital that had stood there before, Teotihuacan never again approached the scale or the regional dominance it had commanded at its height. By the time later Mesoamerican peoples encountered the site in any detail, the ceremonial core had stood empty, weathered, and increasingly mysterious for the better part of 7 centuries. The centuries between the 6th century burning and the Aztec arrival were not entirely empty ones, either. Smaller communities continued living within and around the ruined core for generations, and evidence suggests other Mesoamerican groups, including Toltec-affiliated peoples centered at Tula to the north, periodically visited or briefly resettled parts of the site, sometimes salvaging cut stone and even carved monuments from the original city for reuse in their own, much smaller construction projects. A slow scavenging of the abandoned capital that continued in one form or another for the better part of 1,000 years. Formal archaeological attention didn't arrive until the very end of the 19th century, when Mexican archaeologist Leopoldo Batras began the first sustained excavation and restoration campaigns at the site under the Porfirio Diaz government, work that, judged by later scientific standards, was often rushed and destructive, reconstructing the Pyramid of the Sun's outer facing in ways modern archaeologists still argue distorted its true original profile. It took until 1971 for archaeologists exploring beneath that same pyramid to rediscover the natural cave system the entire monument had originally been built directly above, physical confirmation of just how central that specific cave, and whatever it represented to the city's first builders, had been to the decision to found a metropolis on this exact spot in the first place. Teotihuacan was formally inscribed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1987, a recognition that arrived nearly 2,000 years after construction began and roughly 13 centuries after the city that built it had already burned. That is roughly the state in which the Mexica people, the group history remembers as the Aztecs, found it sometime after their own arrival in the basin of Mexico in the 13th or 14th century. Migrating into a landscape already scattered with the ruins of earlier civilizations, they came upon Teotihuacan's collapsed pyramids and crumbling avenue and responded not with archaeological curiosity but with genuine religious awe, incorporating the site directly into their own cosmology. According to the origin myth later recorded by Spanish chroniclers working with Aztec informants after the conquest, it was here, at Teotihuacan, that the gods themselves gathered in darkness after the destruction of a previous world and threw themselves one by one into a sacred fire to be reborn as the sun and the moon, the humble, disease-scarred god Nanahuatzin leaping first to become the sun, followed by a wealthier, more hesitant god who became the moon. In this telling, the pyramids that still stood on the site weren't the work of any forgotten human civilization at all, but literal monuments marking the spot where the current age of the world itself had begun, which is precisely the reasoning embedded in the name Teotihuacan continues to carry today. Aztec rulers made regular pilgrimages to the ruins long after their own empire had risen to dominate the region, and archaeologists have recovered Aztec-era offerings, incense burners, figurines, and ritual deposits, buried directly into the ruins of far older Teotihuacan structures, evidence of genuine, sustained reverence for a place whose builders the Aztecs plainly understood to be something other than their own direct ancestors. They even absorbed elements of Teotihuacan's own religious imagery into their expanding pantheon, most notably the feathered serpent figure carved so prominently onto the temple facade in the Ciudadela, which resurfaces centuries later in Aztec religion as Quetzalcoatl, one of the most important deities in the entire Mexica cosmological system. A borrowing so thorough that most people encountering the name today have no idea it originated with a civilization that had already been in ruins for the better part of a millennium by the time the Aztecs adopted it as their own. Modern archaeology has made real progress narrowing down who actually built and inhabited Teotihuacan, even without a single surviving inscription naming them, but a full and settled answer still doesn't exist. Linguistic and cultural evidence has been marshaled behind several competing candidates for at least one major ethnic component of the population, including early Nahua speakers, ancestral Totonac communities, and speakers of mixed Soquian languages associated with the earlier Olmec cultural sphere, and given the isotope evidence for genuinely diverse ethnic neighborhoods living side by side within the city, it's entirely possible no single answer will ever fully apply, that Teotihuacan really was, at its height, less a single people's capital than a deliberately multiethnic metropolis organized around shared religious and economic institutions rather than a shared ancestral identity, something closer to a genuine confederation than a conventional nation the way ancient historians typically use that word. So where does this leave the story, sitting here at the end of it, on this high plain ringed by dormant volcanoes? We know a city grew here across a handful of centuries into one of the genuinely largest and most influential urban centers anywhere in the ancient world, laid out with an obsessive geometric precision tied to the stars and the horizon, its avenues and plazas housing perhaps 200,000 people from dozens of different regional backgrounds, all somehow bound together into a single coherent urban order for 400 years. We know its reach extended far past its own borders, reshaping dynastic succession among the Maya more than 1,000 kilometers away, and we know its own ceremonial heart concealed both mass sacrifice on a staggering scale and a sealed underground chamber modeled, as best anyone can currently tell, on the layout of the underworld itself. And we know that sometime around the year 550 or 600, something, internal revolt, drought-driven desperation, external opportunism, or some tangled combination the archaeological record still can't fully separate, brought that 400-year order to a sudden and deliberately violent end. What we don't know, and what may simply never be recoverable given how thoroughly Teotihuacan's builders avoided writing their own names into stone, is what they actually called themselves, what language or languages filled their crowded courtyards and workshops, who exactly held power across those 4 centuries and how, and precisely whose hand set fire to the temples along that long straight avenue in the city's final violent decades. The pyramids are still there today, climbed by millions of visitors every year, exactly where a much later people once stood in genuine awe and decided, reasonably enough given what they were looking at, that only gods could have built something this vast. Whoever actually built it left the monument standing and walked, silently, out of history.